I am so excited for this spa day. Candles lit, music on, hot tub warm and ready. And then my chronic hives come back. Again, in the middle of my spa day. What a wet blanket. Looks like another spell of itchy red skin. If you have chronic spontaneous urticaria, or CSU, there is a different treatment option. Hives during my next spa day? Not if I can help it. Learn more at treatmyhives.com.
The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
No solo vamos a defender las reformas ya hechas, sino que además vamos a impulsar las reformas que aún faltan para lograr ese futuro. Porque queremos ser un país que crece, para ser la Argentina que nunca deberíamos haber dejado de ser, para volver a ser la Argentina grande nuevamente.
Libertarian chainsaw wielder and president of Argentina, Javier Milei has secured a storming victory. His Liberty Advances party and allies secured over 40% of the vote in midterm elections held on Sunday, October 26th. This further secures his free market agenda and expands room for reforms that have already substantially cut Argentina's fiscal deficit and brought inflation down from an eye-watering 211% to an admittedly still painful 32%. Perhaps more importantly, it's a victory of sorts for the power of US-led international capital, which had rushed in to support the country on the condition that Milei prevailed. What this means for Argentina and Milei's backers in the Trump administration is the focus of this week's Viewsroom. Welcome to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that dives into the knottiest topics in economics and corporate finance. I'm your host, Jonathan Guilford. Milei has been a crucial fulcrum around which the new American doctrine of international influence has arranged itself. His populist flair aligns with the US president's iconic plastic style. He's won support from an administration that holds attitudes that range from hostile to actively violent against his peers elsewhere in the Americas. It's an irony of sorts. Unlike Trump, who favors big deficits, free spending, and kicks against orthodoxy, Milei is effectively an agent of that orthodoxy, pushing Argentina to live within its means after a long period of free spending under the country's once dominant Peronist political faction. A key plank to his agenda, though, has been controlling the value of the peso, Argentina's currency, keeping it aloft beyond what most analysts compute is its true value. This artificial stability came under attack in the weeks leading to the election, leading U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to announce a $20 billion support package between currency purchases and a currency swap line at the central bank. Sounds big on paper, and yet it compares to an over $300 billion external debt pile that Argentina has to service. Now that the clouds of electoral uncertainty have passed, the question is whether this imbalance can be maintained. Fortunately, I have two guests closely following the situation to walk me through the ins and outs this week. John Sindro is Breaking View's global economics editor based in London, while Sebastian Pellejo is our markets columnist in New York. John, Sebastian, you are very welcome to the Viewsroom.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Maybe let's just start simple here with what was happening before Milei and Sunday's election. Argentina, obviously no stranger to bailouts. I was amazed to find that it's had an incredible 23 loan programs with the International Monetary Fund since 1958. How exactly did we get here?
I mean, it's a good question, right? And I think the knee-jerk reaction in the market is to say, well, it's Peronism. No, Peronism, it's, if you remember, is this political movement founded in the 40s by Juan Domingo Perón. And, it's built around social justice, but it's basically had both the neoliberal and the populist left sides. And I think people think, well, Kirchnerism, which is the left-wing version of this, is behind the issues that Argentina faces with its debt. But if you go back to why Argentina is currently in this situation, it was actually under Mauricio Macri, the neoliberal president, not under the predecessor of Javier Milei, who was Alberto Fernandez. And if we go further back, I think we all remember, when the peso was pegged to the dollar. This was between 1991 and 2002 under another right-wing, in this case Peronist, but right-wing government, Carlos Menem, and the whole peg ended up breaking down, and the IMF ended up burning its fingers. It failed to preserve the peg, and started on this very, very treacherous path of lending money to Argentina and having to restructure it. And I think for me, the lesson is this, which is Argentina's problems they're structural. It's a country that has what economist Marcelo Diamond dubbed it's an unbalanced productive structure, right? The commodity production of the country is incredibly productive, mainly the agribusiness centered around La Pampa, but also the oil industry centered around Vaca Muerta more recently. And this allowed Argentina at the turn of the 20th century to be basically a rich country. But this agriculture is so productive, right, that manufacturing and deep industrialization, they're not viable, and the exchange rate ends up always being slightly or terribly undervalued. And if you add this with fluctuations in, the world commodity markets, and the fact that when Argentina is in a boom, all this foreign capital rushes in, and some presidents are very happy to take it and borrow, and this was the case under Macri, then what you get is these boom and bust periods of growth, which they're not atypical for an emerging market economy, but they're even more extreme in Argentina. And no matter who's in charge, there's just no way of getting out of this.
Right. I mean, that's sounds like a kind of, just like a doom loop cycle that's just going to repeat again and again. I know, Sebastian, when the IMF first announced its most recent loan program to Argentina, which was $20 billion earlier this year, I know you had perhaps like a slightly more hopeful take on what could happen, and that maybe you've become a little more skeptical of the dynamics right now. Do you want to maybe walk us through kind of what's happening with Milei and what he's trying to do at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's important to maybe break the budget into two components, right? That there's the domestic budget, and then there's how they control trade, exports and imports, right? Milei has targeted, balancing the fiscal budget, which has resulted in large spending cuts, right? That has helped bring inflation down to 2% month over month as of August and September, which, if in a country that was experiencing 60% plus 100% plus inflation, is a significant gain, as well as a minor surplus in its domestic budget. So that has been positive progress for a state that has racked up huge social spending bills and has sort of refused to cut the entitlements program that it's grown over many decades, as John says, right? The issue I've been describing is the fact that the IMF support in the form of $20 billion is not contingent on sort of a balance of payments strategy, as well as other sort of larger reforms that are needed if looking at history and other sort of reconstructions of emerging economies are needed to do this in a sort of measured, stable fashion, right? And so the results has been that you have had a tighter domestic budget, but at the same time, because of the FX controls, you have had a huge depletion in reserves, which makes it much less likely that Argentina will have the capital to pay back its large amount of outstanding debt, which I believe is around.
Just to clarify that for listeners, so basically it's a very simple problem, right? Argentina largely borrows externally in debt that's denominated in dollars. It needs to gain dollars to pay off that debt. But the whole current strategy of keeping the peso high, which I presume is kind of about reducing inflation from imports? Question mark?
Yeah. I mean, competitiveness pressures exist, right? Because imports are essential to earn dollars, right? Agriculture is, 70% of export value, and, the Vaca Muerta does, over 300,000 barrels per day equivalent, according to the energy ministry, right? So, peso stability is sort of aiming to anchor expectations. But, if it is held at a level in which it's overvalued, it does result in these, in these results, as described earlier, that can necessarily hamper the strategy that Milei is trying to enact broadly. That
So
combined with
like you say, it's there's the fiscal balance problem, there's the balance of payments problem, and they're sort of like at odds with each other. Which I guess before we get to the question of whether there is a way to slice through that kind of Gordian knot, I suppose we should talk about what the U.S. did, right? Because Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced what I think people took as quite an unprecedented step in terms of stepping behind Argentina, promising purchases of the peso when it looked like Milei's peg, like the band that he's trying to hold it within, would break, and setting up swap lines and whatnot. I guess kind of interested in either of your take on this, like the degree to which this is unprecedented, and also just doesn't it seem like that's just further locking Argentina into this balance of payments problem?
I would say that, Scott Bessent is trying to do his best Mario Draghi impression from the ECB crisis in some sense.
Right.
If you look at the announcement that came out with the announced sort of $20 billion swap, even before then, it's this very strong language that is meant to imply that the U.S. is backing Argentina. And because the U.S. is able to, print its currency and has this large, ample reserve base, that should in theory stabilize markets. The issue, I would say, is that Scott Bessent is in control of the Treasury, not the Federal Reserve, so it can't necessarily print dollars as needed. It can't access huge unrestricted swap lines that could increasingly help dollarize the Argentinian market or what have you. And so he's sort of stuck between this rock and the hard place where he's trying to project American might through these programs, but is limited by the terms of the stabilization fund from the Treasury that he's using to supplant this. And so in recent weeks, we've seen that stories of him looking to recruit banks and other American enterprises to sort of also invest capital or lend capital to Argentina. So I think he's trying to triage the abilities of the Treasury, the demands of his boss, who is the president, who is liked by Milei and has a family relationship with him, and the realities of sort of conducting fiscal and monetary and trade policy for another nation from afar, right?
Right.
And that all leads into a very contested election, just given the results of Milei's experiment over the past 2 years.
Right. And John, maybe you can explain a little more. So, in an international and historical context, I guess, how unusual is what the U.S. is doing?
I mean, the U.S. has, for example, held Mexico in the past, right, during a currency crisis. But I think what's unprecedented here is the fact that there are no significant trade links between Argentina and the U.S. to warrant this type of intervention. Also, there's no conditionality, right? And here we go to the point that usually when you bail a country out, you impose some changes to policy and you say, well, I'll lend you money, but you have to change the way you do this and this. This is not what's been going on here. And I think it's because the whole premise revolves around the idea that the troubles that Argentina has been having in 2025 have to do with what Milei calls the Cuca risk. And he says that to mean the Peronists are coming back, right? And the market fears they're coming back, thus the peso is depreciating, thus I need more time. And if you buy that premise, and it has to be said, the rally after Milei won does vindicate that at least part of the instability was due to this fear of the populace. Although I will say the peso is down again, but there is part of this that makes sense, and I have to say a lot of the market does buy into the narrative now, and they see a path through which Milei actually has won the time he needs to at least get reelected in 2027, right? Because the restructuring of the debt that happened under the previous administration means that even though the external debt's very large, about 45% of GDP, the payments are actually pretty low. They're under 5% of GDP a year. They're projected to remain so by the IMF. This is far less than many other emerging economies have. So the idea is, well, actually, maybe he will get out of this. Even if the peso is overvalued, maybe it could keep coming down slowly in real terms and everything will be fine. So there is a bullish case for Argentina. The reason I would tend to be far more skeptical, even though, of course, it is always possible that markets can keep an unsustainable thing going sustainably. It's not impossible, right? If he starts borrowing, we saw borrowing costs calm down dramatically. If he starts borrowing at 10%, maybe he can make it. But I will say that the core premise that his policies are helping Argentina is doubtful. I mean, in some cases, they probably are. And Sebastian was mentioning, some cuts that probably are necessary. And there is definitely a need. The issue with the parents is that they have a tendency to start talking about defaulting on everyone, and that of course is no way to run a country. So just warding off that is already a positive for Argentina. But at the core of the problem is, uh, are the financial issues that the Argentine Treasury and the Argentine Central Bank, which was doubling the monetary base annually when he took charge, are those the cause of the problem or the consequence of the problem? Like, are those a result of the currency being in free fall when he comes in because he immediately devalues it, and was already falling before he came in? Did they cause that by printing this much money, or are they the result of suddenly you've got imported inflation and the same amount of pesos buys a lot less stuff, so the entire economy readjusts? And I would argue it's the latter. And an example of this is when he does his immediate devaluation, the monetary base with a lag also grew again and got out of control. And he only managed to lower both inflation and money printing once he actually started controlling the exchange rate, right? So this shows you that actually the stabilization is not, a result of fixing the fiscal issue, but rather he fixed the exchange rate, and now he has powerful friends to keep fixing it. And this allows for interest payments in pesos to be far below the rate of inflation. It allows for the ability to cut the deficit and not worry too much. And he's also had the advantage of a bit of a banking lending boom that has kept the economy more or less afloat, even as austerity
Right.
was biting into it.
But doesn't that fundamentally just make Argentina entirely dependent on external financing then at that point?
Well, that's the
Isn't that just can kicking?
You've got to get dollars, right? Even if the
Right.
immediate need for them is small, it will come. And if he gets his way, we saw this with Macri, right? You had this massive portfolio inflows coming into the country, about 40 billion, 12 months rolling. That's like a lot. It's like twice the the IMF bailout, so the US bailout. And right, if you have that, you have to pay it back. So the money, the dollars, can either come through the capital account, right, borrowing, and if all this borrowing happened through people investing in Argentine equities, then perfect, that's ideal. But that's not going to happen. International capital is not going to do that. So the only way you can get it is straight, is the current account, and it's in deficit again. It's 2% deficit, so it's not going to happen.
I mean, just to make clear, because I feel like from both John and Sebastian, I'm hearing a lot of, I guess, cynicism about whether Mileism can work. I mean, I want to expand on this after you answer, but one word answer, just to know where we all stand. Sebastian, do you think that Mileism can effectively fix the structural issues at the heart of Argentina?
As it's currently defined, no.
Okay, John, do you think it can work?
No, I would say I'm perhaps even a bit more skeptical, because
Right.
there is people who
Here's
say,
the-
well,
yeah.
if Argentina just managed to lower the exchange rate slower, and it has such a potent agribusiness, right, that it can become this commodity exporter again and do fine and get in the dollars. I just don't think any country ever does well doing that.
Right, but that's the thing. Scott Bessent is no stranger to what's going on here in these kind of dynamics, right? He worked for George Soros, who famously broke the Bank of England, who, understands what happens when you have an unsustainable currency peg. And yet he's coming in and essentially taking the opposite trade to what his boss very successfully did all those years ago. And I guess I just want to play devil's advocate here a little bit, because look, I'm no macroeconomic expert, but just from a layman's position, it feels like there's a bit of an epistemic crisis in macro. The Trump administration has kicked against all orthodoxy, and yet no catastrophe has befallen the US, despite many predictions to the contrary. Belligerent negotiations with traditional allies have not yet, torn the Western alliance asunder. Basically, a lot of, I think, what people thought would happen, some very strongly held kind of premises, maybe haven't been played out yet. Now, part of that is we're still very, very early in all of these events. In Argentina, in the Trump administration overall, in the trade war, who knows what the final result is. But I think maybe, if catastrophe is coming, it's slower coming than people thought. Why wouldn't Argentina be different? Is it just that there's a stronger rule of gravity here? Or?
I think you've made my point. Because when you were saying all the money printing, all the deficit spending the US has done domestically in its own currency, right? But even not just the US, you can look at other countries. It hasn't brought the disaster that the orthodoxy thought it would bring. That's my point. So Argentina is focusing on all of those elements, even down to liberalizing capital controls and import controls. We don't want import controls so that dollars flow out, because that's anti pro business. So we don't want to do that. We don't want, even though it could perhaps help us bring down the real exchange rate, because it's not the orthodoxy. So they're not doing it. So that precisely, I'm drawing on the experience of rich countries to say, don't do that, right? Like it's not as important as you think. The exchange rate is demonstrably the main thing. It doesn't mean none of the other stuff matters or nothing he's doing makes sense or can, drive a bit of a private business boom. Fine. But the exchange rate for the emerging economy is everything. If the dollar tomorrow fell 90%, then everything else wouldn't matter, right? That's kind of my point here.
That's interesting. Like, yeah, the idea that like the past year's breaking of orthodoxy shows why hewing to orthodoxy is a problem. I mean, Sebastian, like, do you think that holds for like Argentina's case specifically? Because obviously it's even among like troubled emerging markets, it's a bit of an outlier, right?
Yeah, I mean, as John sort of mentioned, right, the economy is very straightforward in its composition. And in fact, the policies that Milei has instituted has resulted in a destruction of a lot of businesses. You could sort of bifurcate the economy between classes and who has, sort of benefited from these policies, mainly, owners of assets versus who is not, which is, your everyday Argentinian worker, right? So I think, it's difficult to imagine the policies as they currently stand, continuing with and engendering greater support, I should say, right? And so even, to John's point, the fact that sort of the economic logic is stilted and does not have great historical precedent, at the same time, you're now trying to bring in a huge swath of the populace and convincingly on your side, right? I think, what will be most important to watch is how Milei-ism, or whatever you want to call this doctrine, evolves as a result of the election, right? I think, he has been given a much stronger mandate than people have expected, particularly in part because, Peronists did not want to destroy, their political capital trying to rally behind a platform that was very ill-defined in this most recent election. Not to mention the fact that many of the grassroots politicians in Buenos Aires were already elected in the provincial elections the month prior, so had little incentive to sort of combat Milei out in the polls. The signal value here is that I think voters are rewarding continuity and sort of punishing the Peronist fragmentation and lack of options, right? And so I would not take this as an endorsement of every reform that he's proposed, right? At the same time, it does lower the political risk premium, so that supports risk assets, as we've seen the reaction across the gamut of Argentinian assets. But so durability is going to hinge on sort of converting this mandate into legislation and policy that is not only sort of sensible economically, but accepted by the public. And given the variety of balls to juggle there, it's difficult for any leader, let alone one who is very divisive and very combative in his rhetoric as well, right?
I think the question the Argentina bulls have to answer really is, how is this different from Macri? It's not straightforward that it is. You look at the path of, real exchange rate, inflation, everything. You can say Milei's more committed to it, I guess, to the free market reform. But I think that's the question that needs answering if you have faith that this can work.
And I guess as an addendum to that is, what is the United States' resolve towards actually seeing some form of, success in this endeavor that they've taken, right? Like they've, to some degree, successfully helped keep the currency in control for the 2 weeks leading into the election, from the announcement of the swaps to this past Sunday. But this will require if they intend to keep it, much greater support as well. Not to mention, other inflows of capital. We've discussed the debt issue. We've discussed having, the economic mix issue that will require investment, mostly from foreign investors. So the combination of all this requires, some backing of U.S. support. Banks are currently deciding what level and on what terms to provide capital, facing pressure from the Treasury and the White House. So it is easy to imagine in my mind, whether a souring in domestic opinion here in the U.S., whether sort of racking up of dollars committed to this endeavor, that the political will in the U.S. should sort of falter as well. And if given that much of the election and the recent events in Argentina have been contingent on this U.S. support, it's hard to know what the effect would be if that rug was pulled as well, right? So there are these two dynamics between how does Milei evolve post the election, and then how does the U.S. evolve its response as well. But as John has sort of mentioned, the problem is squarely economic, and trying to sort of address it from the sides instead of directly is not going to lead to the outcomes that they desire. So I'm not necessarily despondent that they're going to be hard-fisted on this matter, but there is momentum in the policies that they've had, and how you interpret the election results will be key in evaluating how Argentina progresses.
Right. Will the Argentine Sisyphus continue to get a helping hand behind the boulder from Uncle Sam? All right. I think that's as good a place as any to leave it. Sebastian, John, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Cheryl Pena in New York and Gregory Garner in Toronto. You can listen to a new episode of The Viewsroom every Thursday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to tune in to our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you heard, please follow The Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. We have a new email address where you can send us feedback, which is breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day on breakingviews.com and reuters.com.